Hello, my name is Riqia Taylor,
And I'm Rasha Langston.
and this is our group project for Poly 345 African American Politics. We will be presenting on the documentary At the River I Stand, the climax of the Civil Rights Movement.
One of the most influential scenes of the civil rights movement was led by a resilient and patient Memphis community fighting to create better work conditions, higher pay, and benefits for themselves in a sanitation workplace.
The thesis of this documentary is the organizing of about 1,300 sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee contributed and influenced the larger nationwide civil rights movement by bringing national attention to the union strike, challenging the country's trust in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and being one of the key motivations leading to his assassination. There are several themes identified in this documentary. The first is the organizing of civil society. So we have the Southern Christian Leadership Council, also known as the SCLC. You have many municipal worker unions, such as the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, also known as the AFSCM. We see a number of violent and nonviolent mass resistance.
Okay, for example, a group called the Invaders wanted a larger role in the movement in Memphis. However, their ideologies did not match up with the SCLC, as they were more of a militant group than a nonviolent group.
We see a number of peaceful demonstrations. We see cultural identity in the gathering of the community. We see it in the status of certain leaders, such as city council members. A city council member who was confronted in the midst of that first march that was intended to be peaceful but turned violent. So during this confrontation, he pleads with the police officer that he is a member of city council. He it's almost as if he wanted to use his status to remove him from the situation, and the officer's response is, "I don't care who you are. Either you go home or you're going to see this bullet or these handcuffs." And so this is important because right then and there, his status was irrelevant. He was still black. We also see this in Christianity and song. So throughout the documentary, as the community gathered to work together, we see the church as one of the primary places that they met. They would gather and they would donate food, donate money. And so, really, the church served as the cradle for this movement. And then, song, we see all throughout the documentary that when they gathered, they would sing songs. And you even hear at one point in the documentary during their march, someone say, "Keep singing, keep singing." And really, we saw this as a key motivating factor through their movement throughout the documentary. We also see norms and practices and cultural events of active audience participation. So, we see constant affirmation to the speakers, and in the black community, there is an expectation of responding to whatever effort was being led. We see this key during Martin Luther King Jr.'s visits to Memphis, Tennessee. And then we also see a privilege versus poverty dynamic between the whites and blacks in the community. Our group identified a few historical and social contexts that help us understand the documentary a little better. And so this documentary covers just one of many demonstrations during the civil rights movement. So when you look at the civil rights movement as a whole, this is post radical Reconstruction, where the 14th and 15th Amendment opened the door for black politicians. This is post the influence of Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, the Pan Africanism movement, the influence of W.E.B. Du Bois. This is post the Harlem Renaissance, which highlighted the freedoms of black through expression of art, music, and literary pieces. And really, this is post the emergence of civil society such as the SCLC and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. where we saw successful litigation tactics such as Brown versus Board of Education. This is post and current discrimination of African Americans in the military. And we also just seen two great migration periods of blacks from the south to the north, and continued poverty in black communities. All of these things that have happened before the moment we see in this documentary, fuel the flame known as white resistance, which is really vital to the emotion and energy of the events that take place in Memphis, highlighted in the documentary. Something else that is key in helping us understand the context of this documentary is understanding that the civil rights movement had been challenging the constitutional government, fighting against the injustices of blacks, confronting rule of law primarily at the state level, where rules were being made to govern a segregated society, challenging racial intolerance, and the protection of civil liberties and rights. All of these help us understand the background of the and history of the emotion, passion, and tensions of the sanitation workers. This gives us context to them wanting to push back against their unfair conditions in the workplace. And we also want to note the death of the two workers by poor equipment in the workplace. That was enough to send the sanitation workers, um, that was enough for the sanitation workers and the community to have all hands on deck during the Memphis movement. So, for questions 3 and 4, we are actually going to answer them congruently. And so, this is the part where we recognize 4 concepts and social historical events that we learned about in the course to help us understand the documentary. And so, the first that we want to recognize is the dialectic of human relationships. So, this is the idea that relationships go through a pattern. This pattern includes creation, maintenance, decay or destroy, and recreation. And so, creation in the documentary. A relationship is established between workers and employers. When we look at the maintenance of this relationship, relationships can only last if they can be maintained. We see that this is impossible because the workers voice their concerns that the employers are not willing to meet, and the city is not willing to meet these concerns. The city includes the mayor and city council. So because we see that they're unable to maintain this relationship, it then moves to decay. One person in the relationship, the workers, comes to the conclusion that the relationship is no longer working and needs to move towards destruction. Something needs to be done, and the unfair treatment and wages will not go on. So then we move towards the recreation process. And this one is a very interesting one within the documentary because this is the union's movement. Through the process of recreation, the community of Memphis was strong in their organizing and resistance prior to the presence of Dr. Martin Luther King coming. But let's be clear that him coming and stepping into the movement was extremely influential. During this, they were hit with many challenges that was intended to stop their protest, like being told that what they were doing was illegal. The fact that you are not going to work and you are striking is illegal. Them being arrested during their strikes and their movements. Them being told by council that, okay, we'll come to the table and compromise. We will put some sort of recommendation in place and help you all. And then council reneging on that promise. And then even the assassination of MLK a few days before one of their biggest marches. All of these were contributing factors in their process of recreating a relationship with their employers and with leadership in Memphis. But his death would not stop them from pushing forward, and the community of Memphis continued to march. Their resiliency resulted in them being granted um, higher pay, benefits, and better work conditions. So here we see that they recreated a more healthy, because we know that it wasn't perfect afterwards, but it was more healthy relationship than it was before. And their dynamic with employers shifted towards a more positive dynamic.
Concept we learned in class is the 5 phases of depression, and that includes exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. With exploitation, the workers were given menial jobs that didn't have livable wages, and they couldn't afford clothes. They were given handouts of oversized jackets, oversized hats, oversized shoes, and basically couldn't afford all that they wanted to afford and to pick and choose what they wanted to wear. The second was marginalization, and majority of the population in Memphis was in poverty. They all had the low jobs that no one else wanted, and most couldn't afford their living standard, even their own living standards. The third is powerlessness, and I would say that would be when martial law was included. They called the National Guard on them, policemen, arresting them for unreasonable causes. So with cultural imperialism, the mayor was highly favored in the community, and he thought that favoritism would, come over to help him deal with the striking workers. However, he noticed that he was getting a strong resistance. I also think that he took in consideration of the white community more than he took on to the poor black workers, and he favored their concerns more than the minority. And with violence, it is evident in the protests of the civil societies against the injustices of blacks and the violent response. At one point, as they were marching, the police were pressing up against the protesters, and if they resisted any bit, they started to mace them in the face. And there were other white resistance group that advertised and vocalized their opinions on not having this civil rights movement into their community.
Thirdly, we see different typologies of freedom. And so, just to highlight one of them, Richard King's definition of liberal freedom, the entire process of the movement in Memphis resulted in the win of the sanitation workers receiving better wages, benefits, and improved work conditions. And so, this provided autonomy that impacted other places to move forward in municipal worker unions. This is paralleled with one of Professor King's 5 faces of freedom, which is our fourth point, the internal capacity to act. Going back to the assassination of MLK before the peaceful march, they continued, the community, the union, continued the march. And it was their internal capacity to act that motivated them, and it influenced other workers across the country to organize and form unions that pushed back against their unjust conditions. And one extra thing that we wanted to note that we noticed in the documentary were the strategies against the tripart system. And so we see this in education. This tries to persuade people. And so when the SCLC came in and were really pushing for the community to have a nonviolent movement, they had workshops. They did trainings with the community so that everyone could be on one accord as they went into their nonviolent movement. And then we also see lobbying. So this is the effort to persuade government officials. We see that before any marches took place, that these union workers were in City Hall trying their hardest to get them to recommend to City Council that they needed to, at least at the bare minimum, have a conversation about how they could improve the work conditions and provide these workers with health care and benefits.
This concludes our group project, and thank you for your time.